We're looking at one of the side aisles in the Paris church, Saint Germain. It's since actually been renovated, and all this beautiful paintwork is absolutely brilliant from what I've seen of recent photos. But it was looking a little bit tired when I was here in 2015 and took this photo. Now, again, a 10-minute sketch. So we can't do everything that we can see here, and we certainly can't do much about all the shadows if we're just going to work with a pen, because there isn't time for extensive hatching. But what I really want to do as a 10-minute exercise that I'm doing just to improve my general skill level in 10 minutes a day is to work at getting these columns lined up, the arches that join them, and a sense of distance of space moving back easily, visually easily, because it's all in the right place. The perspective angles are correct for what we're seeing. And this sort of view where we see up into a roof line is very common if we like drawing architecture, and particularly if we like drawing grand architecture with high vaulted ceilings, we come across this sort of view all the time. Now, the first thing I had to do was work out which columns lined up, because the column I started with, the column it lines up with, isn't so obvious to see at a first glance. And I also put this figure in very quickly, both because that way I can then draw what comes behind it, but the figure also gives a sense of scale, and it is also a reference point for me. So I position that, and now I can start moving across. And really, I'm very much using these first two columns I've drawn and working out with subsequent columns I draw, are they higher or lower than the top and base of this first column? And this is really my principle of draw one part at the very start very carefully in proportion, a part that you have a good chance of drawing in proportion, and then use it as like a measuring stick, as a ruler, as a reference point for everything that you draw subsequently. The other thing in this case I had to do was to get the width between these two columns as close as possible to my reference as I could. And basically, I need to then make sure I keep track of exactly what column I'm looking at, when, where, how, particularly when my ink gets close to the paper. It's very easy to think we're looking at one part of the reference and we've actually jumped one column across, and therefore we can get into strife with that. Now, trying to do the first of the arches. They're quite high arches. They almost go upwards a little bit before they curve, and so it's important to pay attention to that sort of thing when we draw. It's not just what the arch looks like in life, but it's how it looks from this angle. And then I've also got these side arches that, of course, are very distorted, very much changed into a partial ellipse. So now I'm doing this column, this archway that's further back that we see. Now, I really don't do much hatching at all in this because I just don't have time. But I do it in a couple of places, as much to help me have a more immediate visual connection between my drawing and the reference. If there's a dark band in a fairly complex, repetitive type of line work scene, then by putting a bit of value onto my drawing in that place helps me align it with what I'm looking at in the reference far more quickly and far more accurately. I'm not as likely to get confused with where I am and what I'm drawing if I can see exactly what this part is in the reference. So I just throw those hatch lines on there. And now I decide to just do this next archway. I almost didn't realize that we're looking up at the underneath of this arch in the first place, because we hadn't done that with the further one because of the angle we were viewing that from. We were looking at it more side on. I just presumed it was going to be the same, and I almost hatched what should be the gold section of the horizontal surface of the arch. But fortunately, I dodged that and managed to get it in place. And so now I'm moving across and working out this right-hand side, which does take up quite a bit of the space. And while it's not particularly the focal point of the scene, it does provide these really strong diagonals, these really high perspective angles that lead into the scene, and from a compositional point of view, I think are quite important. They help us to stay focused, looking through the columns and through the arches right to, well, it's actually some distance we're seeing right down the side of the church here. We're actually looking right up to, I think, the curved end where we can see the supports come back into view because the wall of the church is curving around. So just working out what I'm doing there. I do a bit of a mess up with that section that's above there because in fact it doesn't come down that far. If I look at where the left side of that gold bit is, it comes down into where the shaft of the column starts. So it's really important to check alignment with capitals, especially when we're seeing the capitals from a three-quarter view, with things above and things below. How much does the capital protrude over the top of the shaft of the column on each corner? And depending on the angle and the type of capital, it can be different on different corners of the same capital, let alone on different capitals. So how the actual capital relates to what's above and below it is really important. It's easy to presume that the capital is kind of more squared on than it really is. So now I'm trying to work on some of these further away elements. And look, if you're finding this interesting, please hit the like button for me. That helps me out tremendously. And I'd love to have a comment if you've started doing these every day, or if you try and do them every day. I'd love to hear that. It will certainly encourage me to keep making them if I think people are using them. And so now, fortunately, I notice that there are these long verticals that come down on the right-hand side of this section. And again, these are the sorts of observational details that we need to see. It's easy just to somehow think, oh, the arches keep going back symmetrically and the same left and right because that's what happened so far. It's only by actually observing what's in the reference, not what we've drawn already and not what we're thinking is how it's happening, that we capture the little quirks and variations that often make all the difference in terms of something that looks interesting and something that looks more pedestrian. Now again, you see, I'm not worrying too much about hatching. I do end up doing a little bit of hatching on the right-hand side at the end, simply because I felt that it just needed that to help give a sense of 3 dimensions. So I'm using a 0.1 millimeter pen. It's a bit lighter than I would have normally used, but I didn't want this to look too inky. Particularly since I wasn't going to do the hatching, it was going to be more of a linear effect. Just trying to work out where the bases of these columns are. When we're doing really quick sketches, I think sometimes the bases of the columns, what's important is not so much that we capture the detail that's exactly there, but that we make sure that the angle that follows the base of all the columns joined up, that works. That's the thing to pay attention to, because generally we're not looking at the bases of the columns, but we are seeing the perspective angles that they form. So whenever we have repeated architectural elements that viewed front on create a straight line, we need to make sure that when we don't view them straight on, when we view them from an angle, that we line all those details up on the perspective angle, following the perspective pattern for all the angles on that plane. Put the light in, and now a bit of, look, honestly, this is so rough, I wouldn't even call it hatching. It's almost scribble, but my 10 minutes is pretty much up. So I am feeling that pressure, and I have double timed this part now. So the 10 minutes is definitely up. There's just a couple of minutes now at double time. If you want, you can use the cog icon and take it back to real time, because you can use that to slow down any video by up to half. And the soundtrack is still very understandable if you still want to hear it. So now just a little bit of definition quickly. You'll notice I'm doing horizontal hatching on the columns here, simply because if I do vertical hatching, they tend to all merge together and we lose the hatching lines with the outlines. So sometimes we just have to bite the bullet and go horizontally. Look at the difference putting those shadows make. It's really easy to forget shadows on the ground when we draw, and yet they're so important for helping to define space and light source, and also often the sense of something more off our viewpoint, something that we can't see but intruding, or not intruding, but breaking into what we can see. Just a few more marks just to try and just frame what I've drawn a little bit more. And then we're pretty much done here. Of course, you'll find this photo on my channel community page, so why not go there and have a look at it and give it a go. But otherwise, I think we're done. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. This is a bit of an unusual scene compared to some of the other subjects that I've had in this series, but I think it's a really worthwhile thing to spend 10 minutes or so just playing with and roughing out and seeing what things we do easily well and what things perhaps are more obviously a bit of an issue that we need to concentrate more on. Sometimes it's not so much that we have to practice those things more, but we just have to observe them more slowly when we draw. But look, whatever you draw, or however you draw it, inside or outside, interior or exterior, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.